Hello and welcome to this video. Now this one is kind of a roundup of the section on the League of Nations, and the main question we have to be asking and trying to answer anyway is, why did the League of Nations fail? Overall, after everything we've looked at, what was the main reason? Now as a quick recap, it's kind of first major, it's definitely failed now, is Abyssinia. And they're messing up of that situation in 1935 and 36. And in 1937, Italy itself left the League of Nations, and there were a few other countries left in the League. As you remember, Germany and Japan had also left. And most of the countries that were left had realised it had now completely failed. And instead, many countries across the whole world began to rearm as fast as possible because they were really, really worried that war was inevitable. The war was going to happen, and so the best thing to do was to rearm. And many countries that were left in it, like Britain and France, didn't really take the League of Nations power seriously at all and started following their own policies and the policy of appeasement. But that's for another few videos. Now, we have to be thinking, why did the League of Nations fail? And the best way to remember is the two words, was done. The League failed in Manchuria and Abyssinia because it was done. And what does was done stand for? I'm just going to go through those now. Now, the first problem with the League of Nations is that ultimately it was weak. Straight away, the powers that they put in place were weak powers. And inevitably, all they could really do was little more than tut at the other countries, waggle their finger at them and say, you can't do that. And as we've looked at with Abyssinia, trying to impose some kind of sanctions never worked, and in the end, when the tutting didn't work, or the trying to talk it out didn't work, and the sanctions didn't work, there was no other option except to maybe form an army, and nobody wanted to do that, and they had no standing army of its own. So ultimately it was weak. The second point, and of the was done, is the A, is America. America decided to form the League. They were the ones who came up with it, with Woodrow Wilson's 14 points. And at the end of World War I, as we've said before, it was the strongest nation. It was one of the strongest nations in the world. And it was the one that the League of Nations really needed to kind of ram home that this is a serious institution. This is a serious thing that we're putting together. And after World War I, Britain and France were just not strong enough to impose peace on their own. They needed the support of the USA. At the end of the day, in World War I, the USA had got involved and had helped them, had saved them at the end of World War I. And now, America wasn't even involved in any kind of peace negotiations. It had completely isolated itself and wasn't involved in world affairs. And so, because there was a lack of America, that's why it failed. The S in was done stands for structure. And as we've looked at in previous videos, the League's organisation straight away from the start was just muddled. It was all over the place. It took ages to do anything. Members could veto, so they continually in the council just disagreed. The assembly disagreed. And like we've said before, decisions had to be unanimous. It means they all had to agree. And so when countries couldn't agree, it just left the whole League paralysed. And so their structure was just straight away doomed from the start with that kind of structure. But we have to be thinking sometimes, was it doomed from the start, or was it outside factors that kind of brought it downhill? Well, all the things we've looked at so far, weak American structure, would suggest it was doomed from the start. But there is one factor that we have to consider, maybe say, it wasn't all their fault from the beginning, and that main one is the Great Depression, the Depression of 1929, and the effects that had. You've got to think that if it wasn't for the worldwide depression, would Hitler have come to power? Would Japan have become so imperialistic, the same as Italy? The effects the depression had were massive. Like we've looked at with Manchuria and Abyssinia, it was countries that wanted to get more land and power. They were worried about themselves and didn't really care at all about world peace. And so it's because of the depression that countries started to become more aggressive to other countries. They weren't willing to work together because they had isolated themselves and trying to sort out their own economic problems. So that's the D part of was done. So stands for unsuccessful. And when we've looked at how successful the League of Nations was, they're minor successes. You can't hold them up and say they were great successes, a lot of them. The successes we've looked at are quite minor in the grand scheme of things. And as the more and more the League actually failed, people started to not trust it as much. Because it failed in little places and then bigger places, people just didn't have any faith in it. And like we know, in the end, people just ignored anything they were saying, which was confirmed with Manchuria and Abyssinia. M stands for members. And you've got to remember, in the big four, you had Britain, France, Italy, and Japan. And two of those members, Italy and Japan, completely defied the League of Nations. And Italy weren't just in Abyssinia they defied them in Corfu, which completely undermines it. France and Britain eventually completely betrayed it by following a policy of appeasement instead. And we know in Abyssinia they weren't exactly innocent themselves with the Hall of Al Pact. France as well with the Ruhr crisis. It's this idea, the members, the main big four supposed to be holding this together, really let it down. And lastly, we've got the B of WASDOM, which is big bullies. When they were successful, so the successes we've actually looked at, so in the 1920s, it could be said because it was dealing with small, weak countries as smaller than Italy, France, Britain and Japan, and so could easily deal with the problems. Now, with the Depression in the 1930s, more bigger, powerful countries start to defy the League. So Germany, Italy and Japan, they were the ones who were defying the League. And so when it came to trying to deal with them, the League of Nations just couldn't stop them. They were just too powerful. They'd had success with small countries, but when it came to the big guns, they really couldn't do anything about it. So that was done. The main reason to look at to say, well, that's why the League of Nations failed. That's the two words to remember, was dumb. Weak America, structure, depression, unsuccessful, members, and big bullies. And I want to just take you over here now is a cartoon by David Lowe published on November the 11th, 1938. And, with a cartoon, we've got to try and work out its message. What's David Lowe trying to tell us? And the key thing to start is the date. So he's drawn this on the 11th of November, 1938. So as we know, the 11th of November is Armistice Day. It's when Germany stopped fighting in World War I, and it was that turning point where peace was in the world once again, and it was like, what are we going to do now? And one of the things that came out of World War I was the League of Nations, this idea of bringing peace to the world. And by 1938, like David Lowe's pointing out, that notion of peace had completely failed. And first of all, the two figures on the stone. You've got this guy on the left, who is a more well-dressed gentleman, probably the higher class of society, and on the right we've got the not as well-dressed gentleman, but the middle-class, working-class part of society. And what David Lowe is saying here is that the failure of the League of Nations is affecting all of society. It's not just one part of society, it is affecting everybody. And how do they look on those on that stone? Do they look happy? No. They look depressed. They are silent, as he says, as the title for his cartoon. They are silent, they have nothing to say, they're ashamed, they're upset. And what is glooming in the distance? Well, war. War is here, war is coming, it's in the shadows. You can see a huge cannon in the background, you can see desolation. And David Lowe is saying that there is a reason to be depressed. The League of Nations has failed and war is looming. It's time not to be happy because it is a sad day. The two figures, like I've got at the bottom here, two figures sit on a cracked stone which carries the inscription, League of Nations, foundation stone of a new order laid 1918. Peace hath her sacrifices. And as you can see on the stone, the foundation stone, that stone that is supposed to hold a building together, that stone where you start to build your great building that's going to bring, and in this case is going to bring peace to the world. What has this stone got? It's got a crack. And if a foundation stone has a crack, it can't hold anything up. It won't succeed. All it'll do is it will crumble and fall down. And that hope that you had, and the hope that David Lowe had, and everyone in Britain and the world had in 1918, on the 11th of November 1918, 20 years before, has now vanished. Their building, their hopes, their dreams of peace in the world has failed, and it is crumbling down. And this is why these two figures are looking depressed and now ultimately are getting ready for World War II.